Forge! Gang! I am still a hard man. Let's go! So the stream has begun. Get in here. Come in here and watch the stream with the Forge Smelter. All right, let's see here. All right, adjusting my microphone settings a bit. Adjusting my microphone settings right fast. Can you hear me loud and clear? People in the chat, are you able to hear me? Is it mute? Can you hear me clearly? Just let me know. So anyways, it's the Forge Gang, and I am still a hard man, Imperator of Forge. So today I will continue on with my series, and I'm going to talk about some aspects of life in ancient Israel in the Old Testament. Since last time I covered ancient Egyptian life, I'm going to go ahead and cover some stuff about the Old Testament. Now, I already covered some things about the Garden of Eden and some of the things about the fall of Adam and Eve and the flood of Noah and the dispersal of the nations. I will be talking a bit about the Exodus and some of the life, the day-to-day life of the Israelites. I'm not going to really cover ancient Canaan, the pre-Israelite Canaan region, because that's not really relevant to the topic. It'll just be about the Israelites in the Old Testament. Interdimensional Lizard, let's go! You are coming through loud and clear. Awesome, awesome. All right. So I'm going to start off with the Exodus, the wandering of the Israelites out of Egypt. So Moses demanded for Pharaoh, he was commanded by the burning bush to command Pharaoh to let his people, the Hebrews, go. The Hebrews were in captivity in Egypt, and the Pharaoh refused to let them go. So Moses and Aaron caused the 10 plagues. Well, actually, the God of Israel caused the 10 plagues. Eventually, the Pharaoh complied and let the Hebrews go, and they celebrated Passover. Passover has its origins in the holiday of Passover has its origins in the Exodus, the freeing of the Hebrew slaves. So they wandered across the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army pursued them, and the Egyptian army was destroyed in the Red Sea. The Israelites crossed over and they wandered in the desert. And they suffered many, many temptations, and a lot of them wanted to go back to Egypt, and they wanted to fall back into Egyptian commandments of the law, the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. But because of the Hebrews' unfaithfulness to God, they were forced to wander the wilderness for 40 years. So I'm going to start off with that. I'm not going to talk really about the moral story of the Exodus in general. I'm just going to give you a very brief rundown on the Exodus. So What is the meaning of the wilderness in the Bible and the importance of desert seasons? And this is by Estera Wieja. So, the wilderness meaning of the Bible. Wilderness appears in the Bible regularly, and what is more, it is often the background of significant events. When God freed his people from slavery in Egypt, he didn't bring them straight into the promised land. He took them on a journey first, and not just any journey. He took them into the wilderness for 40 years. What is the meaning of the wilderness? At first, that idea does not sound pleasant at all. The wilderness. Why should we spend any time there? It's hard, it's lonely, and its stillness is deafening. But God had a plan. As the Israelites wandered through the desert, God revealed himself to them more than ever before. So, a path through the wilderness. We avoid the uncomfortable in life because we think that we have very legitimate reasons for doing so. When our life hits the desert, a dry or lonely period, it is very hard to recoup. Our hearts and minds feel weary, burnt out, and everything seems lifeless or pointless. In most extreme cases, even taking a single step out the door seems to require an extreme amount of effort. And yet the desert is not presented as a hopeless place in the Bible. God has used the desert and the wilderness to speak with his people. If you are in the middle of a desert season, you're actually not alone. A place of encounter. It is important we notice the wilderness in the Bible. God spoke to Abraham while he was in the wilderness. God brought the Israelites into the wilderness because he wanted to speak to them at Mount Sinai. Sinai. This is where he spoke to Moses. In the wilderness, God met with Elijah. It was in the desert when God spoke to John the Baptist. So, there are many biblical moments and events that deal with people of devout faith going through trials in the wilderness to push and to test their faith in the Lord, who spent most of his life in these rough conditions. He became known as a voice calling in the wilderness. Each of these stories is filled with miracles. Their seasons were not wasted. On the contrary, God used these difficult times for something meaningful and powerful. In the wilderness, God was present, and in the desert, he made himself known. Hebrew meaning of the word desert. The Hebrew language, which is a big portion of the Bible, was written in, carries so much depth. We can sometimes lose the complex meaning of a word. If we only look at its translation, many seemingly different words can actually be connected to Hebrew because they have a common root, 3 core letters. The Hebrew word for the desert is medbar, medbar, because there are no vowels in Hebrew. The letters that spell it out are MDBR, mebar. Coincidentally, this is also how you spell another Hebrew word, midaber, to speak, medaber, to speak. The wilderness of the Judean hills is where the Holy Spirit sent Jesus before the start of his public ministry. There are many things about the Old Testament and many sorts of meanings and catchphrases and likes and stuff that show their fulfillment in the New Testament. The New Testament is full of Old Testament references, and representations and archetypes or acolytes in the Old Testament that are used by Jesus in the gospel. The Israelites became the people of God by wandering 40 years in the wilderness and being chastised and cleansed in order to fulfill their holy mission. Jesus Christ and John the Baptist both began their ministries. John the Baptist and Jesus Christ both began their ministries by living in the wilderness, going through the desert. Jesus wandered through the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and then was tempted by the devil before he began his public ministry. So those are examples of comparisons. The wilderness of the Judean hills is where the Holy Spirit sent Jesus before the start of his public ministry. He was in the desert so that God could have a conversation with him. Jesus came to the Midbar, the desert, so that God could medaber, speak to him. Jesus didn't wander into the desert by accident. He went there on purpose because he wanted to hear from God. This shows us once again how deep the meaning of the wilderness is in the Bible. Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Elijah, none of them were in the wilderness by accident. God wanted to speak with them. And what better place for an important meeting than the one where there are no distractions? Letting go in the desert. In our Western cultures, we are very used to our comforts. Even as followers of Jesus, we try to avoid the desert, the Medbar. We don't like when life gets hard or barren or lonely. The wilderness makes us feel isolated, so we do what we can to escape it. But what if we asked God about his timing? When is the right time to move on? Is he trying to tell us something? The negative approach to the wilderness is challenged even in the Gospels. Jesus and his disciples often chose the wilderness for rest or some quality time. When he told them about the kingdom of God, in these moments, Yeshua was not being pulled in every direction by those who needed his help. And it was in the desert where Jesus was baptized. There, God announced to the whole world that he loved his only begotten, uncreated Son. Facing the discomfort of the wilderness. Young David was running through the desert when he was trying to flee from King Saul. He was hiding in caves, and you could say he was in a very low place in his life. But it was in that wilderness where he experienced closeness and intimacy with the Lord. David wrote dozens of poems and songs, pouring out of his heart, and he knew God was listening too. We all face things in our lives that feel like the wilderness. Maybe like David, we can't seem to escape our problems. Like Abraham, we are not sure where to go or what to do. Maybe like Moses, we feel overwhelmed with our responsibilities. Or like Elijah, we are simply burnt out. When the Bible gives wilderness meaning, although the hardship we want to avoid, the discomfort of the desert, it is in fact an invitation to an encounter. God wants to speak to us. Thanks to Scripture, we know for a fact that in the desert is where the presence of God is most prevalent. Jesus chose the wilderness because he knew that while being alone and tempted, there was strength and authority to be gained by being alone with his Father. No matter how isolated you may feel today, God wants to come into your midbar, desert, be with you, and midaber, speak to you. He is in the midst of your wilderness. All right, so that is the close of that. So let that be an important lesson in regards to having to go through trials and temptations. Think of the book of Job and think of the prophet Job. Think of the prophet Jonah. Think of the temptations, you know. Don't be like Judas Iscariot. Anyways, we will talk more about the ancient kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Ancient Israel, history of the kingdoms and dynasties formed by ancient Jewish people. Archaeological excavation and the Hebrew Bible help scholars piece together the storied history. The stela of Amenophis III, shown here at the Cairo Museum in Egypt. This enormous stela, hewn out of black granite, bears the earliest mention of Israel of any of the exhibits in the National Museum of Egypt. Image credit the print collector Getty Images. The term ancient Israel is used by scholars to refer to the tribes, kingdoms, and dynasties formed by ancient Jewish people in the Levant, an area that encompasses modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Scholars draw mainly on three sources to reconstruct the history of ancient Israel: archaeological excavations, the Hebrew Bible and texts that are not found in the Hebrew Bible. The use of the Hebrew Bible and texts that are not found in the Hebrew Bible. The use of the Hebrew Bible can be challenging for scholars. While some of the accounts are thought by many scholars to be mystical, others, such as Nebuchadnezzar's II's conquest of Jerusalem, are known to have actually happened as a fact. So this is the early history. The earliest mention of the word Israel comes from a stele, an inscription carved on stone found in Thebes. This is Thebes in Egypt, modern-day Luxor, and erected by the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned from about roughly 1213 BC to 1203 BC. The inscription mentions a military campaign in the Levant during which Merneptah supposedly laid waste to Israel, among other kingdoms and cities in the region. Now, if you read the book of the Kings and the Chronicles, you will note that an Egyptian pharaoh raided the southern Judean lands not very long before the Babylonian captivity. In fact, Judah actually tried to form an alliance with Egypt and actually tried to rely on help from the pharaoh and from the Egyptians. And that was one of the things that God punished Judah by putting the kingdom of Judah under Babylonian captivity, was because of their over-reliance on the Egyptians. among other kingdoms and cities of the region. The Hebrew Bible claims that the Jewish people fled Egypt as refugees before arriving with some divine help in the Levant, where they started conquering territory from the local population, such as the Canaanites. Now, if you go back to Noah and to Noah's nakedness and the fact that Ham, the son of Noah, saw Noah's nakedness, Noah cursed Ham's son Canaan. And Canaan and his descendants would be a servant of servants to Shem and Japheth. The descendants of Canaan, the Canaanites, became subjected to and conquered by Israel, in part because of this curse that God put on Ham's son Canaan. When exactly this would have happened is unclear, though it would have been more than 3,000 years ago. Whether there is any truth to this biblical account is a point of contention among modern-day scholars. Some scholars think that there was no exodus from Egypt, while others believe that some Jewish people could have fled Egypt in the second millennium BC. James Hoffmeier, an archaeologist and professor at Trinity International University in Illinois, pointed out in papers and lectures that people from the Levant did live in ancient Egypt at different points in Egypt's history. It also noted that the ancient city of Ramesses, mentioned in the Exodus stories told in the Hebrew Bible, did exist, and archaeologists have discovered that it flourished for several centuries during the second millennium BC, before it was abandoned about 3,100 years ago. King David. And so we have here a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. King David bearing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. This was made in the early 16th century, this painting. According to the Hebrew Bible, a man named David rose to become Israel's king after slaying a giant named Goliath in a battle that led to the rout of a Philistine army. King David then led a series of military campaigns that made Israel a powerful kingdom centered at Jerusalem, according to the Hebrew Bible. After King David's death, possibly around 3,000 years ago, his son Solomon took over the kingdom and constructed what is called the First Temple, supposedly the first purpose-built temple in which to worship God. The temple was located in Jerusalem and contained the Ark of the Covenant, which held tablets inscribed with the Ten Commandments. Recent archaeological excavations show that smaller temples also existed in Israel at the time of the first temple was flourishing. So about the 11th century, 10th century BC to the 6th century BC would be the first temple period. Most of what scholars know about King David comes from the Hebrew Bible. However, fragments of an inscription found at the archaeological site of Tel Dan in 1993 mention a house of David. The fragmented inscription dates over 2,800 years. Although the meaning of the words is debated by scholars, many think it's evidence that a ruler named David really existed. However, a number of archaeologists have noted that evidence for King David's supposedly vast kingdom is scarce. Jerusalem appears to have been sparsely populated around 3,000 years ago. Israel Frankenstein, a professor at Tel Aviv University, wrote in 2010, over a century of archaeological explorations in Jerusalem, the capital of the glamorous biblical United Monarchy, failed to reveal evidence of any meaningful 10th century building activity. Finkelstein wrote in a paper published in 2010 in a book, One God, One Cult, One Nation, Archaeological and Biblical Perspectives. De Gruyter, 2010. Finkelstein wrote that King David's kingdom was likely a more modest state than the one described in the Hebrew Bible. Over the last decade, a 3,000-year-old site called Kheirbet Karabet Kiayatha has been excavated by a team of archaeologists. The site is located west of Jerusalem, and the excavators believe it was controlled by King David. They even claim to have found a palace that might have belonged to King David. Live Science reported in 2013. Northern and Southern Kingdoms. Northern and Southern Kingdoms. After King Solomon's death in around 930 BC, the kingdom split into a northern kingdom, which retained the name Israel, and a southern kingdom called Judah, named after the tribe of Judah that dominated the new kingdom. Accounts in the Hebrew Bible suggest that grievances over taxes and corvée labor, free labor that had to be done for the state, played a role in the breakup. The Hebrew Bible says that at the time of the breakup, an Egyptian pharaoh named Shishak launched a military campaign in the Levant, where he carried out a successful raid of Jerusalem, the capital of the Kingdom of Judah, and took war booty back home. Ancient Egyptian records say that around this time a pharaoh named Sheshonq the first ruled Egypt. Sheshonq launched a military campaign into the Levant and conquered a number of settlements, according to these records. However, it's unclear from the surviving evidence whether he successfully attacked Jerusalem. Many scholars believe that the names Shishak and Sheshonq refer to the same pharaoh. Israel and Judah coexisted for about 2 centuries. Although they often fought each other, Israel also fought against a non-Jewish kingdom called Moab, which was located largely in modern-day Jordan. A 9th century BC stele created by a Moabite king discusses the conflict between Israel and Moab. It is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. What's up, Krail? How are you doing, man? 07. Gang activity in chat. That's right. We're talking about ancient Israel and Judah. Hopefully, when I had my air conditioner on, I was able to come out clearly, because I don't want to do this again. After I'm finished with this, I don't want to go back and do this again, just to clear out the audio. Okay, the next section is Assyrian involvement. Here, one of a series of panels showing Tiglath-Pileser III's campaign in southern Iraq. Image credit is Universal History Archive, Getty Images. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BC, the Assyrian Empire, originally from the region of what is now northern Iraq, grew in size and conquered an empire that stretched from modern-day Iraq to the borders of Egypt and probably even Libya. As the Assyrian Empire grew, it came into contact with both Israel and Judah. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III claims that an Israeli king named Jehu was forced to pay tribute to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, who reigned from 859 to 824 BC. The obelisk is now in the British Museum. The Hebrew Bible states that during the rule of Israel's king Pekah, King Pekah, who reigned around 735 BC, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BC, launched a military campaign that conquered several cities from Israel. Pekah was assassinated around 732 BC. Has Israel's losses mounted, and a new king named Hosea took control of what was left of Israel. Accounts recorded in the Hebrew Bible suggest that the Assyrian campaign against Israel was part of a larger war in which Israel and Judah fought against each other. The Assyrians sided with Judah, while a kingdom named Aram sided with Israel. Hosea was forced to pay tribute to the Assyrians, the Hebrew Bible says. He later rebelled but was crushed by Assyrian forces around 723 BC. The exact date is not entirely clear. The kingdom of Israel then came to an end, and its remaining territory was incorporated into the Assyrian Empire. Many Israelites were deported to Assyria. The Hebrew Bible says that Judah was the last Jewish kingdom standing, although it was forced to pay tribute to Assyria. In 705 BC, Sennacherib ascended to the throne of Assyria and launched a military campaign against Judah that culminated in the siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. Both the Hebrew Bible and cuneiform text tell of the siege. The Hebrew Bible says that Taharka Teharka, a ruler, Tararka, a ruler who controlled both Nubia and Egypt, marched against Sennacherib, which may have helped end the siege. The Hebrew Bible also says that at one point the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35 and Isaiah chapter 37 verse 36. Cuneiform texts written by the Assyrians also say that Sennacherib failed to take Jerusalem. They don't specify as to why, only saying that Sennacherib trapped Hezekiah, the king of Judah, in Jerusalem like a caged bird, and that the Assyrian king captured other cities that Hezekiah had controlled. The Assyrian texts claim that Hezekiah paid an enormous tribute to Sennacherib before the Assyrian king went home. Fall of Judah and Babylonian exile. A painting showing the burning of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar's army. Wilson Corbis, Getty Images. Ultimately, it was not the Assyrian Empire that destroyed Judah. Nearly a century after Sennacherib's unsuccessful siege of Jerusalem, a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar II conquered much of the Assyrians' former empire and laid siege to Jerusalem. His forces conquered the city in 587 BC, destroyed the first temple along with much of the rest of Jerusalem, and deported many of Judah's inhabitants to Babylonia, modern-day southern Iraq. Both the Hebrew Bible and cuneiform tablets that were written in Nebuchadnezzar II's time recorded these events. The fate of the Ark of the Covenant, which was housed in the first temple, is unknown. Some ancient writers said that the ark was brought back to Babylon, while others suggested that it was hidden away. In the millennia after the destruction of the first temple, a number of stories were spun about the supposed location of the lost ark. In recent years, a number of cuneiform tablets have emerged from Iraq that reveal details of the lives of some of the Jewish deportees. Many of these tablets were purchased by private collectors on the antiquities market, raising concerns that some of the tablets may have been looted. The tablets give details on Jewish people who lived at a village called Al-Yahudu, which in Akkadian means the village of Judea. The tablets were written by Babylonian scribes on behalf of the Judean families that lived in and around Al-Yahudu. Kathleen Abraham, a professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium, wrote in a paper for an exhibition catalog, Light and Shadows, The Story of Iran and the Jews, Bet Hatfutsat 2011. The tablets show that the exiles and their descendants had, at least to some extent, adopted the local language, script, and legal traditions of Babylonia. A relatively short time after their arrival there, Abraham wrote, "The Babylonians were eventually conquered by the ancient Persians in 539 BC, and the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who died in 530 BC, gave the Jews permission to return to Jerusalem." And this begins the Second Temple period. The Hasmonean dynasty, or the Hasmonean dynasty. The Persian Empire was virtually destroyed in the 4th century BC after suffering a series of stunning defeats at the hands of Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer an empire that stretched from Macedonia in what is today Bulgaria and Kosovo, about Bulgaria, Kosovo, and northern Greece, to Afghanistan. Even before Alexander's time, Greek forces launched raids on Persian territories, including Israel. A 2,500-year-old helmet that may be from the Greek raid was found in Haifa harbor in 2007. Alexander's empire rapidly fell apart following his death in 323 BC. One of his generals, Seleucus Nicator, Necator, formed an empire that eventually controlled ancient Israel. The Seleucid Empire, as it is called by modern-day historians, was passed down through the Seleucid family line for about 250 years. The Seleucid Empire began to weaken during the 2nd century BC, and a line of Jewish rulers descended from a priest named Simon Maccabeus gained semi-autonomy and eventually full independence from the Seleucids. This line of rulers is called the Hasmonean dynasty. Hasmonean dynasty by modern-day scholars. By 100 BC, the Hasmoneans had gained control of the territory that was once controlled by Iron Age Israel and Judah, as well as territories of those kingdoms had never controlled, such as some areas of Jordan. So there is this state, it's called Edom, and the Hasmoneans and later the Herodians conquered Edom, and there is reports that some of the Israelites or Jews intermarried with the Edomites. Herod the Great was descended from the Edomites in part. And some biblical scholars or some Christian scholars claim that Herod the Great and then his son Herod Antipas had illegitimate rulership over Judea because they were descended from Edom, Edomites. All right. However, the Hasmonean dynasty's success proved short-lived. Roman power grew in the eastern Mediterranean during the 1st century BC, taking territory in Anatolia during the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC, gradually inching closer to Hasmonean territory. The Roman general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus more commonly known as Pompey the Great, took advantage of a Hasmonean civil war to launch a military expedition into Hasmonean territory. Jerusalem fell to Pompey in 63 BC. And from that point on, the territories that the Hasmoneans controlled were effectively under Roman rule, with Herod the Great eventually being named as a client king. Herod the Great. This is the Masada Plateau in Israel. While the Romans held sway over the former Hasmonean territories, they did not impose Roman rule directly. Instead, a number of Jewish rulers controlled the territories as client kings of Rome. The most famous of these client kings was Herod the Great, who lived from 73 BC to 4 BC. The Roman general Mark Antony was a key supporter of Herod and supplied the military strength necessary to cement Herod's position as king of Judea. Barry Strauss, a professor of history and classics, wrote in his book, The War That Made the Roman Empire, Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian at Actium, Simon and Schuster 2022. Despite this, Antony also forced Herod to cede land to Cleopatra VII, Strauss wrote. Herod became well known for his building achievements. Without a doubt, Herod, was the greatest builder in the Holy Land, planning and overseeing the execution of palaces, fortresses, theaters, amphitheaters, harbors, and the entire city of Caesarea. And to crown them all, he organized the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem. Oh, what happened to you, Sebastian Moran? I wasn't able to call you on Skype. I was wondering if you were all right. Giza Vermes, who was Professor Emeritus of Jewish Studies at Oxford University in the UK, wrote in his book, The True Herod, Bloomsbury, 2014. Herod built what is today called the Second Temple in Jerusalem, a replacement of sorts for the First Temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. Herod also constructed a series of palaces at Masada. Biblical literature often vilifies Herod, claiming that he tried to seek out and kill Jesus when he was a baby, as he supposedly perceived the infant as a threat to his rule. One biblical story claims that he killed all the infants living in Bethlehem in hopes of killing Jesus. Scholars are generally skeptical of these biblical claims and doubt that they actually happened. Some scholars think that a group called the Essenes established a retreat at Qumran during or shortly after King Herod's reign. The Dead Sea Scrolls, thousands of fragments from 900 manuscripts, were found in 11 nearby hills near Qumran in the 1940s and 1950s. An additional scroll was found blank inside another cave in 2017. Some of the scrolls contain parts of the Hebrew Bible, while others include calendars, community rules, and astronomical texts. And finally, we end with the rebellions against Rome. Rebellions against Rome. After Herod's death around 4 BC, Rome asserted more control over the area and ruled parts of Israel directly. These parts were governed by prefects who were appointed by Rome, such as Pontius Pilate. Tensions between the region's Jewish inhabitants and Roman rulers increased and came to a head in AD 66. A rebellion in AD 70 culminated in the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple by Roman forces. Resistance continued after the city's fall. The rebels' last major stronghold was at Masada, which Herod the Great had built as a fortress with aid from Mark Antony, and this became the rebels' last stronghold. It didn't fall until AD 73 or AD 74, after a protracted Roman siege. Masada's defenders were part of a group of modern-day scholars often refer to as zealots. The ancient Jewish writer Josephus, who lived from AD 37 to 100, wrote that the zealots took their own lives rather than surrender to the Romans. For the husbands tenderly embraced their wives, and took their children into their arms, and gave the longest parting kisses to them, with tear in their eyes, before they committed suicide, Josephus wrote. Further rebellions occurred over the decades. The final rebellion was crushed in AD 136. The Roman writer Cassius Dio, who lived circa AD 155 to 235 to AD 235, wrote that this last rebellion led to the desolation of the Jewish population. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire was past finding out. Thus, nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. Dio wrote. The translation is by Ernest Carey from Volume 8 of the Loeb Classical Library, published in 1925. Archaeologists are still finding treasure hoards buried by people who lived during this rebellion. In the millennia afterward, the Jewish diaspora spread throughout the world. The modern state of Israel was established in 1948, with Jerusalem as its capital. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem holds many of the Dead Sea Scrolls and numerous artifacts from Israel's ancient and modern history. Archaeologists plan to restart excavations at Masada in 2023. More information on their finds and plans can be found on the excavation's website. The Return of the Warhammer! SMH at Assyrians. Dude, Assyria was a badass back in its heyday in the 8th century BC. All right. I might not be able to finish all of this, but I'll go ahead and try. All right, so this is Life in the Old Testament by Tim Lambert. The Israelites were monotheists. They worshipped only one God. One of the 12 tribes of Israel, the Levites, were priests. Since they did not own land, the other tribes gave the Levites 1/10 of their crops and domestic animals. Furthermore, 48 towns in Israel were set aside for the Levites. In return, they sacrificed animals to God. The people around the Israelites were polytheists. They worshipped many gods. The chief god of the Philistines was Dagon. The chief god of the Moabites was Chemosh. The Canaanites worshipped Baal, the god of rain, Baal, Baal. The Canaanites worshipped Baal, the god of rain and storms. They worshipped Baal in high places, such as at hilltops. They also worshipped his wife, Asherah, a fertility goddess. They worshipped wooden poles dedicated to her. Old Testament society. In Israel, most people lived by farming, and most of them lived in small villages. Only a small minority lived in towns. Furthermore, most of the towns were much smaller than modern-day towns. Walls surrounded towns in Israel, and inside houses were tightly cramped together. Important meetings were held in the gateways of the town walls. Markets were also held in gateways. Like other ancient peoples, the Israelites kept slaves. Prisoners of war were often made slaves. Furthermore, some Israelites were so poor that they were forced to sell themselves or their children into slavery. However, if you owned an Israelite slave, you could only do so for 6 years. At the end of that period, the 7th year, you were supposed to set him free. People in Israel got married very young. Legally, a boy could marry when he was 13. A girl could marry when she was 12. Girls learned skills like spinning, weaving, and baking from their mothers. Boys learned their father's trade. In ancient Israel, women could own property. The book of Proverbs describes an ideal woman. It says, she considers a field and buys it. Proverbs chapter 31, verse 16. As well as making clothes for her family, the ideal woman sells clothes to merchants. When a father died, his sons inherited his property. The oldest son was given a double share. Daughters could only inherit property if there were no sons. However, sons who inherited property were expected to support the women in the family. There were also some laws to protect the very poor from starvation. The law said that when you harvested your grain, you should not reap to the very edges of the field, or gather up any stalks of grain left behind by the harvesters. Instead, the poor were allowed to collect them. When you beat the olives from your trees, you were not supposed to go over the trees a second time. Instead, you were to leave any leftover olives for the poor. When you harvested your grapes, you were not supposed to go back over the vines, but leave any grapes still there for the poor. The law also said you could eat grapes from your neighbor's vineyard, provided you did not collect any and put them in a basket. You were also allowed to pick ears of grain from a field, provided you only used your hands and not a tool to pick them. Old Testament houses. In patriarchal times, people lived in tents made of goat's hair. Later, people lived in houses made of stone or mud bricks. The poorest people lived in houses with just one room. The room was divided into two parts. The half nearest the door had a floor of beaten earth. In winter, domestic animals lived there. The family lived on a raised platform in the other half of the room. People who were slightly better off sometimes had an upper story. The roof was also important. The family dried fruit and grains on the roof of their house, and if the weather was very hot, they slept there. Wealthy people's houses were very different. They consisted of several rooms arranged around a courtyard. However, even rich people did not have panes of glass in their windows, and there were no chimneys to carry away smoke. Poor people had very little furniture. Beds were usually just mattresses full of wool or straw, which were laid out on the raised platform at night. The whole family slept on the mattress under goats' hair blankets. Poor people sat on stools. Chairs were a luxury. Even tables were expensive, and poor families often made do with a straw mat laid out on the floor. However, rich people had comfortable furniture, including proper beds made of wood with fine wool blankets and pillows. In Israel, houses were lit by oil lamps. People burned dried grass or thorn bushes or dried animal dung on their fires. Old Testament clothes. Men wore loincloths. On top, they wore tunics. Women wore long tunics, often embroidered, which stretched to their ankles. In cold weather, people wore thick wool cloaks. Both sexes wore leather sandals. Clothes were made of linen or wool or sometimes camel hair. Women wore jewelry, if they could afford it, that is, such as bracelets, anklets, necklaces, pendants, and rings. Old Testament food. In the Old Testament times, bread was the main food of ordinary people. Meat was a luxury, and only the rich could afford to eat it often. Fine bread made from wheat was expensive. The poor often ate coarse bread made from barley. Grain was ground to flour by women using millstones. The Israelites were forbidden to eat pork, but they did eat beef, goat, and mutton. For vegetables, they grew beans, cucumbers, garlic, leeks, onions, and lentils. They also ate fruits such as figs, pomegranates, and grapes, as well as nuts like almonds and pistachio nuts. The Israelites also ate cheese and eggs. Fish were also an important part of their diet. Herbs were used to season food, and honey was used to sweeten it. Olives were also important. They were eaten fresh or pickled. They were also crushed to make olive oil. Everybody drank wine. People obtained water from wells. They also stored water in cisterns. A cistern was a small underground reservoir shaped like a light bulb with a stone or wooden cover. Work in the Old Testament. Most people in Israel lived by farming. Every year their lives were governed by the same cycle. In autumn they picked olives. In October and November early rain fell after the long dry summer. From November to January the land was plowed, and crops of flax, for linen, wheat, and barley were sown. From January to March, people planted vegetables. The later rains came in March and April. At that time, the people harvested flax. In May and June, they harvested barley and wheat. During June, July, and August, they pruned vines. Grapes were harvested in August and September. So were pomegranates and figs. Meanwhile, shepherds looked after sheep and goats. The two were kept together. Both sheep and goats provided milk. Sheep provided wool, and goats' hair was used to make coarse cloth. Goat skins were used to make containers for milk, water, and wine. Farmers also kept oxen and asses. Both were used for pulling plows. Oxen also threshed grain by walking on it. Farming was back-breaking work in Old Testament times, and farmers faced the danger of drought and locusts, which devastated crops. This is a locust. In fact, locusts were actually one of the 10 plagues that befell Egypt in the Exodus. Although there were no factories in Israel, there were industries. Most craftsmen worked in their own homes. Craftsmen included potters, blacksmiths, bronzesmiths, goldsmiths, and silversmiths. There were also many stone masons and carpenters. In Old Testament times, most people traveled by foot, by walking. Otherwise, if they could afford it, the most common means of land transport was the donkey. Horses were expensive to keep, so they were usually reserved for war, although rich people sometimes traveled in horse-drawn chariots. Merchants used camels to carry goods, and farmers often used carts pulled by donkeys or oxen. There were no proper roads in Old Testament times. They were just dirt tracks, and after rain they turned to mud. The Israelites were not a seafaring people. However, King Solomon did build a fleet. At that time, ships had only a single mast and a single sail. They were steered by very large oars. They were stirred by very large oars. Old Testament warfare. Most Israelite soldiers fought on foot. Kings had chariots and horses, but the Israelites fought in the hills where chariots were not very practical. They were far more useful on plains. The Israelites used bows and arrows and also slings. The sling is a surprisingly accurate and effective weapon. For hand-to-hand fighting, soldiers used axes and clubs. They also threw spears and javelins. At least some soldiers did wear armor. At least some soldiers wore armor. They also carried shields made of a wooden frame covered in leather. Towns were protected by walls, and kings also built fortresses in key positions to defend the country from raids or from external attacks. Animals and plants of the Old Testament. Lions once lived in Israel in the Jordan Valley. There were also wolves that preyed on sheep. Furthermore, there were leopards in Israel and Syrian brown bears, which were sometimes dangerous to human beings. Foxes also lived in Israel. They liked eating fruit and sometimes damaged wine in vineyards. There were also jackals in Israel, as well as deer, gazelles, and wild goats. Many fruit trees grew in Israel, almonds, pomegranate, and fig trees. There were also date palms. Oak trees were common in Israel. So were poplars and pine and fir trees, which grew in the mountains. Acacia trees grew in the desert. Acacia trees grew in the desert. Nevertheless, Israel was not densely wooded. There were many wildflowers in Israel. Unfortunately, there were also thorns and thistles. The prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah often would talk about how there would be famine in the land, and the debaucherous and apostate people would walk in nothing but thorns and thistles. And they would have to cut their hair off and put ash on their face and commit to lamentations in cutting all of their hair off and putting ash on their face. And they would basically lamentate on their, I guess, their apostasy from the Mosaic law. Much of the religion and much of the culture and the activities of Iron Age Israel and Judah was greatly influenced by what became the Mosaic law and much of the Jewish codes or Jewish codexes. There were also various laws and charters that the kings, first of the United Kingdom and then of Israel and Judah, also passed that were technically not in the Mosaic law. It's also important to note that in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel only says that the priests of Zodok can be Levitical priests. Only the sons of the priest of Zodok and a certain line of Levites could thereafter be practicing Levites. And the rest of the tribe of the Levites lost their rights to be practicing as high priests. So Ezekiel also added on some stuff too. So, what was life like in biblical times? The Bible focuses on questions of religion and politics, overwhelmingly emphasizing city life at the expense of rural life. Archaeology, in contrast, can help us to better understand the life of most Israelites who did not live in cities, and supplies a better understanding of such mundane questions as to what they did for a living and what they ate. So this is a man dressed in period roles. This is a man dressed in period clothes, rolls dough on with a rolling pin. Yes, they actually had rolling pins in ancient Israel. Nazareth Village, Israel, December 16th, 2016. To some extent, we can learn about life in biblical times by combining the biblical text, but our ability to extract reliable data from the biblical text alone is hampered by a number of problems. First, the Bible does not always give a clear answer, either because we no longer understand certain terms, or because textual variants say different things, or because of different biblical passages written by different authors offer contradictory information. Second, and more broadly, the Hebrew Bible is mainly interested in recalling key events and the roles that certain personalities, kings and prophets, played in them. Even putting aside the question of historical accuracy, this introduces biases into our picture of life, since it inevitably focuses on the elites or information of interest to elites. In other words, the main concern of the scribes who authored the biblical texts is with the upper class, while the average man and woman are, for the most part, left out. Thus, from the text, we get a certain picture of what life might have been like in the cities such as Jerusalem, Samaria, and Lachish, but not what was going on in the small towns and villages where most of the population resided. This situation can be remedied by archaeological work and the analysis of finds related to everyday life. Today, this type of work is referred to as household archaeology. Using the latter approach, we can learn about the socio-economic conditions of the majority of inhabitants of the land in these times. With the help of archaeology, we can find out what activity was going on in their life. Let's look at food production, including the shepherding farming dichotomy, as an example. There was a lot of shepherding of sheep and goats as well as farming. Nomadic shepherds in Genesis. Early on in the Bible, we are confronted by a story that depicts a sharp contrast between two lifestyles, the farmer and the shepherd. Genesis chapter 4, verse 2. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In this case, the farmer Cain murders his brother Abel, the shepherd, which implies that the author favored shepherding over farming. This fits with the fact that Genesis continues with the stories of the patriarchs, all of whom are depicted as shepherds living in tents and herding their flocks and living in the wilderness. In light of this, scholars and lay people long assumed that the Israelites began as shepherds and imagined something akin to the Bedouin lifestyle, as seen in the Levant in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Early scholars would thus speak of a Bronze Age, early Israelite patriarchal period characterized by nomadism. Nevertheless, this goes beyond the evidence in a number of respects. First, we do not know whether the stories about the patriarchs are based on historical personages, and if so, when they lived. Second, even if it is based on real people or a real lifestyle, the periodization of those people as patriarchs, i.e., biological ancestors of the Israelites living in an earlier period, is likely artificial. Therefore, it is hard to say that the nomadic lifestyle of the patriarchs is a depiction of a particular period in Israelite history. If anything, it is a reflection of a certain lifestyle prevalent in the ancient Near East that existed among the Israelites and that has lasted even to the modern period under certain conditions. Tent-dwelling nomads. That segments of Israelite society lived in tents is well documented in Jeremiah chapter 35, set in the late 7th, early 6th centuries BCE. It describes the sons of Rechab as tent dwellers. Jeremiah chapter 35, verse 7, and idealizes this way of life. Jeremiah chapter 35, verse 6. They replied, "We will not drink wine, for our ancestor Jonadab, son of Rechab, commanded us, you shall never drink wine, either you or your children, nor shall you build houses or sow fields or plant vineyards, nor shall you own such things. But you shall live in tents all your days, so that you may live long upon the land where you sojourn The lifestyle of a nomadic shepherd could be quite difficult, as Jacob says in his rant to Laban, Genesis chapter 31, verse 38. These 20 years I have spent in your service. Your ewes and she-goats never miscarried, nor did I feast on rams from your flock. That which was torn by beasts I never brought to you. I myself made good the loss. You exacted it of me, whether snatched by day or snatched by night. Often scorching heat ravaged me by day, and frost by night, and sheep fled from my eyes. We also learn from the stories of Rebekah and Rachel that young girls would be placed in charge of the herds, a practice that remained common among Bedouins into modern times. Nomadic, transhumant, and sedentary shepherds. Yet not all tent-dwelling shepherds were nomadic. Instead, they should be subdivided into two types, nomadic and transhumant. Nomadic shepherds do not live in one set place. They have no set home, but travel a circuit along with their flocks following seasonal growth. Transhumant shepherds also travel with their flocks, but they have a home base to which they return when they can, often maintaining a social and trade relationship with a given village where people lived year-round. How prevalent either of these lifestyles may have been in the biblical period is difficult to know, as no one actual remains give us quantifiable data for herders in this period. In any event, tent-dwelling Semitic shepherds are difficult to find in the archaeological record. More common would have been sedentary shepherds, i.e., villagers who maintain small flocks, including cattle for plowing and pulling carts. Wandering shepherds do not generally keep cattle. These differ from both the nomadic and the transhumant shepherds. By the way, the Hyksos, the dynasty of the Hyksos who invaded Egypt, they were known by the Egyptians as the shepherd kings. So there's something to think about. Village life. The archaeological evidence concerning village life is quite extensive. Starting in the period of the settlement, ancient Israelites lived in small villages dotting the hill country and occupied by family units. The villages were built in a circle, a design that provided security for the inhabitants and their domestic animals. Village life continued in the monarchic period, but at the same time, towns and cities began to appear as well. Small villages or farmsteads remained unfortified and continued in their circular design. In contrast, cities and even towns were fortified, and many of them, houses were built adjacent to and as part of the city wall. Remember Rahab living in the wall, Joshua chapter 2, verse 15. Houses. Both rural and urban settlements made use of a new house type that was introduced in the settlement period and solidified in the monarchic period. The style house is known in scholarship as the four-room house or pillared courtyard house, terms that relate to the recovered floor plan or to the construction method respectively. Three pillared houses adjacent to each other. Seung Ho Bang, Lahave Research Project, pillars and cobbled floor. O. Biroski, LayHave Research Project. The four-room designation describes the design of the ground floor of the house remains, which had one broad room in the back, and three long rooms perpendicular to the broad room, the middle of which possibly served as a courtyard. The pillared house designation describes the fact that most of these houses, which had upper stories, had pillars made each of one large cut stone or a stack of cut or field stones that provided support for upper stories. Archaeological remains provide information related to the daily activities that took place, especially on the ground floor. These include food preparation, textile production, tool production and repair, storage of commodities, sheltering animals, and more. Activities took place in certain areas of the house which could change depending on the season and needs. Most houses would have had an upstairs as well, accessible by ladder, which was likely where the family members slept. Storage jars, O. Biroski, LayHave Research Project. Kitchen floor with pillars, loom weights, mortar, Seung Ho Bang, LayHave Research Project. The village economy. During the pre-monarchic period, most Israelites resorted to barter using surplus to get certain commodities. In fact, it was their very ability to produce surpluses that allowed for the formation of the state and monarchy. As such, complex forms of government require tax revenue to survive. Think of Egypt, for example, and Assyria. During the period of the monarchy, commerce using precious metals for exchange was introduced. This did not bring an end to barter, but made it possible to import goods from other regions. Thus, imported goods are ubiquitous. They can be found not only in the cities and towns, but even in the villages, indicating that even the rural population was not isolated. Consumption of animals. Has noted rural Israelites kept animals, sedentary shepherding, which provided not only milk and meat for nourishment, but also byproducts such as wool, hair, skin, and bone. The most standard herd animals were black goats and fat-tail Awazi sheep, the native animals of the region. In addition, sedentary herders also kept cattle, which were used for meat and milk as well as for plowing. Donkeys were also used for plowing and for transportation, but not for food. Meat. To learn more about which animals were eaten and how they were prepared, zooarchaeologists study the remains of animal bones. Some bones of domestic animals used for food, such as small and large cattle, exhibit cut marks showing how the animals were dismembered and sometimes can indicate whether butchering was done by professionals or novices. The age of the animals and the specific parts help determine whether the animals were locally raised or purchased, shedding light on the socio-economic status of the population residing in different sections of a site. In short, wealthier people could afford better cuts, even if this meant purchasing the meat from outside sources. Meat was not consumed on a daily basis, but only on special occasions such as festivals or when hosting guests. Milk. In addition to meat, the female animals provided milk. The Bible refers to Canaan as a land flowing with milk and honey. 20 times. Milk is also the drink of choice for Yael to serve Sisera, where he appears in her tent parched. Judges chapter 4, verse 19, chapter 5, verse 25. In addition, the biblical text describes several dairy byproducts, such as cheese, curds, yogurt, etc., that cannot be recovered in archaeological excavations. Skin, hair, and wool. Animals provided more than food. Animal skins were used to make leather for shoes, belts, containers, etc. Goat hair could be used for weaving tent cloth and sacks, while sheep wool could be used for clothing. Though it is very rare to find remnants of clothing or tents, as these objects decompose rather quickly. Evidence of textile production comes from the recovery of objects that were used in the process, such as spindle whorls, distaffs, loom weights, and bone spatulas, all used in weaving. The finished products were not just for local consumption, but for trading. Artistic representations, especially Assyrian, depict what these garments might have looked like. Extra biblical documents record the fact that garments made in Judah were highly prized by the Assyrians. These are loom weights, Seong Hobang Lehav Research Project. Fish and fowl. Many inland sites yielded fish bones originating in various bodies of water, including the Mediterranean and the Nile. Numbers chapter 11, verse 5 mentions that the Israelites ate fish. Ate fish in Egypt, and archaeology has recovered fish bones showing that the Israelites ate fish during biblical times in Israel as well. The fish gate of Jerusalem, Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 and 10, Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 3, chapter 12, verse 39, 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 14 indicates that fish were marketed in this inland city. Such fish were likely dried, smoked, or salted. The list of unclean birds, Leviticus chapter 11, verses 13 to 19, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 12 to 18, suggests very strongly that the ancient Israelites consumed fowl, although the domesticated chicken was introduced in ancient Israel toward the end of the Iron Age too. Wild birds were hunted using traps and nets. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 5, Amos chapter 3, verse 5. Eggs of wild birds were collected for food as well. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 6, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 14. Agriculture. Despite the negative depiction of Cain the farmer and the description of Israel's patriarchs as nomadic shepherds, rural Israelites engaged in agriculture as their primary occupation. To make the hill country slopes accessible, they made wide use of terracing, although the Bible never mentions this, and plastered cisterns in biblical Hebrew, which allowed them to store water from the rainy season into the dry season. Agricultural calendar. The agricultural year is laid out in a document dating to the 10th century, discovered in 1908 at Tel Gezer by R.A.S. McAllister, and known as the Gezer calendar, the transition is as follows: 2 months of ingathering olives, 2 months of sowing cereals, 2 months of late sowing legumes and vegetables, 1 month of hoeing weeds for hay, 1 month of harvesting barley, 1 month of harvesting wheat and measuring grain, 2 months of grape harvesting, 1 month of ingathering summer fruit. Abiyah, possibly name of the scribe. If we think about the year beginning in the spring as the Torah does, the Israelite agricultural cycle began with barley harvest, spring equinox in late April, followed by the harvest of wheat, late April to late May. Grapes were harvested in June and July, other summer fruit in late July to late August, and the ingathering season concluded with 2 months of olive harvesting, late August to late October. These seasons are commemorated in particular Israelite festivals, specifically Matzot, unleavened bread, is celebrated between the barley and wheat harvest. Katzar, harvest. Shovot, weeks. Bikurim, first produce. Bikurim, first produce at the end of the wheat season, and Sukkot, boofs. Asif, ingathering between the fruit and olive harvest. Moreover, whereas in the Torah's spring calendar, Sukkot is in the middle of the year, some verses imply that it was once at the beginning, as it is in the Jewish autumn calendar. Agricultural products. Agriculture was the Israelites' main sources of food: bread, wine, and oil. Bread made from wheat or barley was considered the sine qua non of a meal, so much so that the Hebrew word is also a general term for food. Wine was the most common drink. In fact, wine was so identified with the southern Levant that the ancient Greek aliva, iovia, olivo, Latin vino, and eventually English words for wine are all derivative of the West Semitic yen, yayin. The Bible also makes repeated reference to shekar, probably beer, from which we can deduce that this was also produced and consumed. A third important product was olive oil, which was used in preparing different foods and was also used for lighting oil lamps, for medicinal and cultic purposes, and more. Evidence from biblical law collections confirms the centrality of these 3 products, from which the Israelites are commanded to bring their first produce offerings and tithes. Numbers chapter 18, verse 12. All the best of the new oil and all the best of the new wine and grain, the choice parts that they present to Yahweh, I give to you. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22. You shall surely tithe all the produce of your sowing which the field brings forth each year. and you shall eat before Yahweh your God in the place where he will chose for his name to reside. Chose for his name to reside. The tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the firstborn of your cattle and your flock. In fact, the centrality of these products prompted some sectarian Jews in the Second Temple period to celebrate the festival of first produce 3 times in 50-day increments, one for each of the products: wheat, wine, and then oil, fruit, and jam. In addition to bread, wine, and olive oil, the Bible makes reference to fruits and honey as the natural produce of the land. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8. A land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing. Israelite farmers would dry these fruits so they would keep for longer, and would make jam-like products. This is likely what the text here means by honey, though wild bee honey is referenced in the stories of Samson, Judges chapter 14, verse 8, and Jonathan, 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 26, 29, and 43. And an apiary with clay beehives was uncovered in Iron Age 2a Tel Rehov. The archaeological picture. Most of the products described above have been found in excavations, either as residue or in a carbonized or charred state. These include grain, e.g. wheat, barley, legumes, pits and pips, e.g. olives and grapes, and pieces of wood. Sometimes whole fruits, like figs and pomegranates, are found, making the identification easier. The cultivation of olives and grapes, their processing and consumption are evident by the recovery of pits and pips. Food preparation. Archaeology also tells us a lot about methods of food preparation. The finding of bread ovens, hearths, various types of cooking pots, grinding installations, wine and olive presses, threshing floors, etc., assists us in determining how food was prepared and illustrate verbal descriptions in the text. When we read about the woman who dropped a fragment of the upper grindstone on Abimelech's head, Judges chapter 9, verses 53. We can know what this object was because archaeology produced numerous such objects. Many grinding installations discovered in food preparation areas illustrate how Samson was made to grind grain. Judges chapter 16, verse 21. At one point during this period, beam presses were introduced, which made the production of olive oil much more efficient. Cooking pot in situ. Suang Hobang Lehav Research Project. Grinding installation Oborowski Lehav Research Project. General environment beyond the farms and herds. Archaeology also contributes to our understanding of the general environment in which the ancient Israelites lived. Pollen, coming from archaeological levels, serves as witness for the types of flora present in ancient times. Some of these were cultivated by the ancient farmers, but others grew wild. The same is true of animal bones from wild animals. Some animals, such as gazelles, were used for food. The story of Jacob and Esau mentions hunting as a supplementary source of food, and the recovery of wild animal bones in domestic context demonstrates that this was in fact the case. Other animals, such as rodents, foxes, hedgehogs, etc., simply died in the vicinity. We also find the remains of work animals such as donkeys and even pets. Yes, the ancient Israelites had cats and dogs. Some surprisingly useful data about the ancient environment comes from the remains of land snails retrieved from different strata, as they can help us reconstruct ancient climate prevalent in various periods. Certain conditions are more favorable to certain kinds of snails. In short, archaeology brings the realia to the text of life. The realia of the text to life. It provides physical witness to the verbal description and fills in the gaps of the text left open. It helps us to see what life was like for the majority of the Israelite slash Judahite population that did not live in major cities and formed the basis of biblical society. And so, with that, I have finished up my study for today in regards to the common life, that is, the life of the common people throughout the period of the Old Testament. I did not go into a lot of details about the prophets, the wandering in the desert. I didn't really talk much about the reign of the kings or what the prophets said and claimed, but more so I talked about the food, what they ate, what they drank, the type of houses they lived in, the manners of which they made their produce, etc., in relation to how they obeyed and followed the Mosaic law. Another factor, too, to point out is that not everyone in Israel and Judah were necessarily Israelites. There were Gentile slaves in Israel and Judah. But overall, despite the many trials, the many deprivations, and the struggles of the earlier Israelites, they maintained their faith to God. They retained their faith and they followed through. But from the reigns of King Solomon and King David onwards, and even earlier with Saul, the Israelites began to fall into apostasy. More and more, the vanity of the Pharisees was coming out in the final centuries before the birth of Jesus Christ. And eventually, the apostasy of the Israelites would lead them into captivity in Babylon, and then into the captivity of various foreign nations. And finally, in the New Testament, the apostasy and the vanity of the Pharisees was demonstrated and shown by the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And finally, with the sacrifice on Mount Calvary, this Old Testament law was done away. So thank you for coming and listening to my reading of life in the Old Testament. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that I gave you a very substantial amount of information in relation to day-to-day life in the Old Testament. And the New Testament also, much of this lifestyle continued right into the New Testament as well. So, Interdimensional Lizard says, let's go! Interdimensional Lizard, you are coming through loud and clear. Awesome, awesome. What's up, Krail? Krail says, 07. Gang activity in chat. Hell yeah. Earl Pipe says SMH at Assyrians. Yeah, the Assyrians produced some of the best war machines, some of the best siege equipment, and some of the best war tactics of the age. In fact, some of the first earliest informal long-term sieges against cities were actually begun by the Assyrians. And a lot of general rules and customs about warfare and how to do battle and stuff in the Iron Age was first started by the Assyrians. What's up, Sebastian Moran? Sebastian Moran says, the return of the Warhammer! Little Shemmy, just be rilin', always just be freestylin'. All right, so that's going to be the end of it. Thank you all for coming in and watching. This has been Imperator of Forge, the Warhammer. Thank you for watching and have an excellent day.